This is Ryan Cook from Moody Theological Seminary, and in this video I want to talk a little bit about the history of the study of the Hebrew language. Now in this course you're not really learning Hebrew like to be a fluent reader of the Hebrew language, but you are going to be studying dynamics of the Hebrew language. You're going to learn a lot about it so that you can be faithful expositors of the Old Testament and access tools that engage in using the original language. And so in order to be able to do that, we really stand on the shoulders that have gone before us of many people who have devoted their lives to studying the Hebrew language in order to be able to use the Old Testament for ministry. And I want to tell a little bit of their story in this video. If you think of who is the first Hebrew teacher in the world that we know of, we have to go all the way back to Ezra. Ezra was a scribe who was one of the exiles living in the Persian Empire. He's living in Persia. And when Cyrus, the Persian king, gave the decree that the Jewish people could return back to their homeland from exile, sometime later after the initial wave of returnees, Ezra went. And one of the things that Ezra did is that he taught the Old Testament, taught the law of God, taught the scriptures to the people of Israel at that time. Now, one of the things that was interesting is that because the Jewish people had been living in exile for so long, most of them could not speak Hebrew as a native language any longer. Instead, they were speaking Aramaic, which was the language of the Persian Empire. And so you get this really interesting verse in Nehemiah 8:8 where it says, they, that is Ezra and the Levitical scribes working underneath him, read from the scroll or from the book, from the law of God, translating it to give the sense so that they understood the reading. So the picture here is that Ezra, as the teacher, is reading the law of God, reading from the scriptures in Hebrew, and then he's translating it into Aramaic so that the people could understand it. And the Levites who were under him were doing the same thing. And so what you have here is a group of people who had devoted themselves to be teachers of the scriptures and learned the Hebrew language so that they could translate it and teach it faithfully to the people. So this is really the first movement of people who wanted to be involved in ministry having to learn another language to be able to teach the scriptures to the congregation. Now, as you go past the old period of the Old Testament into the intertestamental period, there are two really important works that I want to mention here. So many Jewish people were living outside the land of Israel in the intertestamental time period, living in Egypt, living in Babylon, Persia. And of course, you had the conquest of Alexander the Great, the spread of the Greek language. And so again, most Jewish people could not speak Hebrew as a native language. And so in order to serve this community, there were groups of anonymous scribes that translated the Old Testament into Greek, which is called the Greek Septuagint. That is a really important translation of the Old Testament that really was the Bible of the early church. In fact, when the New Testament quotes from the Old Testament, very often it quotes directly from the Septuagint, from the Greek translation of the Old Testament. And then you had another group of anonymous scribes that translated the Old Testament into Aramaic, and those are called the Targumim, into the Aramaic Targum, so that people who are native Aramaic speakers can have access to scripture in a language that they can understand. As you move past the period of the New Testament into the early church period, the early church was really devoted to the Old Testament. They accepted the Hebrew scriptures as their own, and it became a part of their Bible. In fact, even before the New Testament was written, the Old Testament was their scripture that they had. That's the scripture that the New Testament writers referred to, and they were very careful readers of the Old Testament. Now, interestingly though, as the early church became predominantly Gentile, there were not many people in the early church who could read Hebrew. And it would have been very hard to do so. There were no Hebrew grammars, there were no Hebrew lexicons or dictionaries that they could reference. So to learn Hebrew, you really had to sit down with someone who knew it and kind of go line by line between, say, the Greek and the Hebrew in order to be able to understand or to learn the language. One of the few early Christians who did that was Origen. Origen was a 2nd, 3rd century early church father who was very involved in debates and outreach evangelism to the Jewish people. And one of the things that he got kind of frustrated with was he would show from the Old Testament how these Old Testament prophecies pointed forward to Jesus as the Messiah. And a lot of his Jewish dialogue partners would say, well, that's what the Greek says, but if you could read the Hebrew, you would know that it really says something else. They kind of appealed to the Hebrew to try to undermine Origen's arguments. And so what Origen did is he devoted himself to learning Hebrew and producing a resource to help the church with this particular issue. He created what's called the Hexapla. That is a 6-column parallel Old Testament where the first column had the Hebrew text. The next column was a Greek transliteration of the Hebrew, kind of what the Hebrew sounds like in Greek letters. And then several different recensions or versions of the Old Testament translated into Greek, followed by his own translation of the Old Testament into Greek. So really remarkable scholarly achievement that was really, he undertook that task for very missional reasons. And that was a resource that for hundreds of years, early church pastors and teachers, evangelists would access this resource. They'd travel to, it was housed at the library in Caesarea. They'd travel there to be able to copy out portions of it and things like that. So Origen's one of those people that really devoted themselves to learning Hebrew to be able to create a resource like this for the early church. The next important figure in our story is this guy named Jerome. Jerome was a Western church father, that is, he was from the Latin-speaking world. And one of the problems that the Latin-speaking world had was they had a lot of different Latin translations of the Old Testament that often didn't agree with each other. And their translations were actually based on the Greek Septuagint. So they were actually another language removed from the original Hebrew. Jerome was one of many people who were kind of frustrated by this. And he decided, kind of with the leadership of the church at the time, he was going to devote himself to fixing this problem. And so what Jerome decided to do was to learn Hebrew. Sat down with someone who knew it and painstakingly learned the Hebrew language. He lived in Bethlehem, in the land of Israel. In fact, you today can go visit his study where he translated the Old Testament from Hebrew into Latin. It's in the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem, still stands to this day. And he undertook that labor for the mission of the church, translated the Old Testament from Hebrew into Latin, and that became the Bible, the Old Testament of the Western church for over 1,000 years after that. And then we get to this guy named Augustine, who was actually a contemporary with Jerome. And I want to read you a little clip from Augustine was a pastor, was a bishop, was a pastor of pastors in North Africa. And he wrote a little book called On Christian Teaching. It's a delightful little book. It's essentially kind of a book that teaches hermeneutics in the first half, kind of how to study the Bible. And in the second half, it's kind of on preaching, homiletics, how to preach scripture. It's a very practical book. You can tell that he is writing this to people who are engaged in ministry. And what's fascinating in this book is he has a section where he talks about the language skills that a pastor needs for ministry. And here's what he says. He says, "The great remedy for ignorance is knowledge of the languages. All men who speak the Latin tongue, of whom are those I have undertaken to instruct," that is, he's writing in Latin to Latin-speaking people. He says, "If you speak Latin, you need 2 other languages for the knowledge of Scripture, Hebrew and Greek, that they may have recourse to the original texts if the endless diversity of the Latin translators throw them into doubt." Again, this is before Jerome finished his translation of the Old Testament into Latin. What's fascinating to me about this paragraph is Augustine tells these pastors working under him they need to learn Hebrew and Greek. Augustine himself did not know Hebrew and really didn't know Greek either. But for guys like Augustine and for the pastors working under him, it really wasn't even possible for them to learn Hebrew. As I mentioned, there were no Hebrew grammars, there were no Hebrew lexicons. How are they going to learn Hebrew? So what I see here from Augustine is sort of an aspirational statement. What he's saying is, if we could do pastoral training in the best possible way, we would be teaching people Hebrew and Greek. You really need to know Hebrew and Greek. Now, we can't do it now, so we're going to do the best we can with what we have. But if you ever have the opportunity to learn Hebrew and Greek, you should grab it with both your hands. You should definitely do it. So I just think it's fascinating that he writes it like this is what we should do, even though, again, in his lifetime, it really wasn't possible for any of the people he's instructing to be able to do this. But he knew how important it would be. We're going to speed through time here now pretty quickly. Through the medieval time, there were a group of people called the medieval Christian Hebraists, that is, people who had a lot of dialogue with the Jewish community in Europe. They learned Hebrew. They kept knowledge of Hebrew alive within a Christian context. And then there was a real breakthrough. In 1506, Johannes Reuchlin, a German scholar, published De Rudimentis Hebraicus, which was the first real Hebrew grammar and lexicon. And that really was like the Rosetta Stone for Hebrew. That cracked the code where now knowledge of Hebrew could become much more widespread. Anyone could pick up a grammar and lexicon and essentially teach themselves Hebrew if they were dedicated enough. And this is the grammar that Martin Luther used. He ended up, of course, translating the Old Testament into German. In fact, Luther says this in one of his table talks to young pastors. He says, "If I were younger, I'd want to learn this language, Hebrew, for without it, one can never properly understand the Holy Scripture." So just in conclusion here, since the time of Ezra, the study of the Old Testament in its original language has been seen as vitally important. The early church fathers understood and taught that learning Hebrew was essential, even though they themselves didn't have the opportunity to do it. So if they were in your place, they would be jealous and encourage you to expand all the effort and energy you can to take advantage of this opportunity. So I'd like to say if they were in your place, again, they would be really jealous. Now, we're privileged today to have excellent grammars, lexicons, Bible software, and the time to pursue this language. So let's do it with excellence. And in this class, even though you're not learning the full Hebrew language, it is going to be a challenging class. There are things you're going to have to memorize. Careful thinking and study you'll have to do about the dynamics of how the Hebrew language works. So let's do this with excellence so that we can be faithful expositors of Scripture and make these people who went before us proud of how we're able to use the incredible resources that we have at our fingertips today.